"You're not getting on this plane." The words cracked through the crowded check-in hall like a gunshot. For a moment, the entire priority lane at Terminal 4 of John F. Kennedy International Airport went still. Suitcases stopped rolling. Conversations snapped shut. A businessman halfway through a sip of coffee froze with the cup hovering under his nose. Behind the polished counter stood Linda Parker, 52 years old, 23 years working the same airline desk. Short grey hair pulled tight behind her ears, reading glasses perched low on the bridge of her nose. She had perfected the expression, that look airport staff get when they decide, in one glance, that someone does not belong. And right now her eyes were locked on two young women standing on the red carpet of the first-class priority lane. Ava Collins and Maya Collins. 24 years old, twin sisters, though Ava was older by 4 minutes and carried herself like it. To most people in the terminal, they looked like every other Gen Z traveler flooding airports these days. Oversized beige hoodies, faded denim, white sneakers that had seen better days. Their long braids swung softly as they shifted their weight beside a luggage cart stacked with matte silver Rimowa suitcases. They had been laughing 30 seconds earlier. Now the laughter was gone. Ava blinked once, slowly, like someone making sure she had heard correctly. "I'm sorry," she said. Linda did not repeat herself. She leaned forward slightly over the counter, fingers tapping the plastic edge with a slow, deliberate rhythm. "You heard me," she said flatly. "This lane is for priority passengers. First class, executive partners, corporate accounts." Her eyes dropped to Ava's hoodie, then to Maya's sneakers, then back up. "The economy line is around the corner near the restrooms." Behind the twins, a tall man in a navy suit shifted impatiently. His leather briefcase brushed against Ava's suitcase wheel. A couple standing farther back leaned sideways to see the confrontation. Ava didn't move. She adjusted the grip on her passport and spoke calmly. "We know where the line is," she said. "We're flying first class." Linda's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. More like someone tasting something sour. "Of course you are," she said. Her fingers slid across the keyboard in front of her. The monitor's blue glow reflected in her glasses. Boarding passes. Maya stepped forward. She had the softer face of the two sisters, rounder eyes, a warmth that usually disarmed people within seconds. She held out her phone with the digital boarding pass open. "Here you go," she said gently. "We checked in online, but the app said we needed document verification." Linda didn't scan the pass. She just stared at the screen. Then she stared at Maya, then at Ava. The pause stretched. Airports are loud places. Announcements echo. Suitcases clatter. People argue into phones. But around that check-in counter, the noise seemed to thin. Linda's eyes narrowed slightly as she read the name on the screen. "Collins," she murmured. Her voice carried a faint edge now. Ava Collins. Maya Collins. She leaned back in her chair. Interesting. Ava felt it instantly. That shift in the air. Anyone who has ever been quietly judged in public knows that exact moment. It arrives like cold wind under a door. "What's the problem?" Ava asked. Linda tapped a key. The system pulled up the ticket classification. Her eyebrows lifted. "Oh," she said slowly. "Well, that's fascinating." She turned the monitor slightly so she could read it again. "Executive partner status." The businessman behind the twins leaned forward a few inches, curious now. Linda looked back at the sisters. "That classification," she said, dragging the words out slowly, "is reserved for board members and top-tier corporate affiliates of Centurion Air." Ava nodded once. "Correct." Linda laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "Right," she said. "And I'm the Queen of England." Maya blinked. "I'm sorry?" Linda's patience evaporated. "Look," she said sharply, leaning forward again. "I don't know whose corporate account you pulled these tickets from, or what little scam you're running with cloned boarding passes." She slid the phone back across the counter with 2 fingers. "But I'm not in the mood today." Maya's smile disappeared. "Our father booked those tickets." Linda waved a dismissive hand. "I don't care if your father is Jay-Z." The words snapped through the air. The 2 spots back in line exchanged a glance. Linda's voice grew louder. "We've had multiple alerts about fraudulent bookings coming out of compromised corporate accounts this month. And guess what?" She gestured at them. "You fit the profile perfectly." Ava felt Maya stiffen beside her. "Excuse me," Maya said. "You heard me." Linda folded her arms. "You are holding up the priority line. Step aside so my actual first-class passengers can check in." The businessman behind them cleared his throat loudly. "Come on," he muttered. "Some of us have flights to catch." Ava turned her head slightly but didn't look at him. Then she faced Linda again. The softness had drained from her voice. "Scan the tickets," she said. Linda's lips tightened. "If they're fake, call security." Ava leaned forward just a fraction. "But you're not going to dismiss us because you don't think we look like we belong here." That sentence landed like a stone in water. The ripple spread through the small crowd forming around the counter. Linda stood up slowly. At 5'6", she wasn't particularly tall, but from behind the raised podium she could look down at most passengers. Her face flushed a blotchy red. "I am the lead agent on this floor," she said sharply, "and I have full discretion to deny boarding to anyone exhibiting aggressive behavior." She pointed a rigid finger toward Ava. "And right now your tone is extremely aggressive." Ava stared at her. The trap was obvious. Accuse them of fraud. Provoke them. Then ban them for attitude. A trick as old as bureaucracy itself. Behind them, the line had doubled. Phones were starting to lift quietly. Linda reached for the radio clipped to her belt. Her voice cut across the terminal. "Security." 2 TSA officers near the oversized baggage drop glanced over. Linda waved them forward. The crowd parted slightly as they approached. One officer was heavyset with a thick moustache. Officer Miller. The other was younger. Officer Davis. Miller rested a hand casually on his belt as he reached the counter. "What's going on, Linda?" She didn't hesitate. "These 2 individuals are refusing to leave the priority lane," she said, pointing directly at Ava and Maya. "They are in possession of fraudulent boarding passes and are becoming belligerent." Maya stared at her. "We haven't even moved," she said quietly. Officer Miller didn't ask to see the tickets. He looked at the sisters, then at the growing line, then back at Linda. His decision was already made. "Ladies," he said firmly, "you're going to need to grab your bags and come with us." Ava slowly exhaled through her nose. The terminal lights reflected faintly in her dark eyes. For the first time since the confrontation began, her hand slid toward her phone in her pocket. Somewhere far away in Manhattan, a man who controlled the fuel flowing through nearly every aircraft at this airport had no idea that his morning was about to change. Officer Miller did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Ladies," he said again, slower this time, "grab your bags." The authority in his tone was calm, practiced, the kind that ends conversations before they start. Maya looked at Ava, her eyes wide, the first flash of real panic finally breaking through her composure. "This is insane," she whispered. Ava didn't answer right away. Her gaze drifted past the officers, back to Linda Parker. Linda had already sat down again behind the counter, fingers moving across her keyboard like nothing unusual had happened. She was already checking in the next passenger. The tall man in the navy suit stepped forward eagerly, sliding his passport across the counter. "About time," he muttered. Linda smiled politely at him. "Good morning, sir." The twins might as well have disappeared. Maya swallowed. "You're seriously doing this?" she said softly. Linda didn't look up. "Security has asked you to leave the area," she said flatly. "Please comply." Officer Davis shifted his weight and gestured toward the concourse. "Let's go." Ava slowly pulled her phone from her pocket. The motion made Officer Miller stiffen slightly. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I'm going to ask you to put the phone away." Ava didn't dial. Not yet. She looked at him, then at Davis, then back to Linda. "Did you scan the tickets?" Ava asked. Linda exhaled loudly through her nose, like someone exhausted by stupidity. "I don't need to scan them," she said. "The system already tells me everything I need to know." Ava tilted her head slightly. "No," she said quietly. "It doesn't." A few people in line leaned closer now. Airports are strange places. Everyone is in a hurry. Everyone wants privacy. But the moment something dramatic happens, strangers become an audience. Officer Miller stepped a little closer. "Ma'am," he said again, "let's move." Ava slipped the phone back into her pocket. She reached for the handle of her suitcase. For a moment, it looked like she was going to comply without another word. Then she paused and looked up at Linda one more time. "You have the name, right?" Ava said. Linda finally looked up. "What?" "Our name," Ava said. "You saw it on the ticket." Linda leaned back in her chair. "Of course I did." Ava nodded once. "Good." She grabbed Maya's arm gently. "Come on." The sisters stepped away from the counter as the officers guided them toward the open concourse. Behind them, the line surged forward immediately, like water filling a gap. Conversation resumed. Suitcases rolled. The moment was already dissolving. But not entirely, because a few phones were still pointed at the twins as they walked, and humiliation has a way of burning hotter when you know someone is recording it. They stopped near a bank of vending machines beside a column overlooking the main terminal walkway. Officer Miller crossed his arms. "You'll need to stay here while we verify your information." "Verify what?" Maya asked. "Your tickets," Davis said. Maya laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "You could have verified them back there." Davis didn't respond. Miller glanced toward the check-in desk, then back to them. "Just wait here." The officers stepped a few feet away, pretending to watch the flow of passengers. Maya turned to Ava immediately. "Oh my God," she whispered. "She flagged us. She actually flagged us." Ava's jaw tightened. Across the terminal, Linda Parker was laughing lightly with a passenger as she tagged a suitcase. Like nothing had happened. Maya's voice cracked. Everyone was staring. Ava's eyes didn't leave the counter. "I know." Maya wiped her face quickly with the sleeve of her hoodie. "This is so humiliating." A group of college kids walked past, whispering and glancing back. Someone was definitely still filming. Ava pulled out her phone again. Her hands were steady now. Maya watched her. "Are you calling Mom?" Ava unlocked the screen. "No." Her thumb hovered over a contact name. Maya leaned closer. "Then who?" Ava pressed the call button. "Dad?" The line rang once, twice, then clicked. "Hey, kiddo," a deep voice answered. Jonathan Collins was sitting at the head of a long glass conference table 30 floors above Midtown Manhattan. 12 executives were watching a quarterly projection presentation on the wall screen. The CFO had just started explaining the logistics expansion numbers. Jonathan held up one finger. The room went silent immediately. On the speakerphone, Ava's voice came through tight and controlled. "Dad?" Something in that single word made Jonathan sit up straighter. "You should be boarding," he said. "Everything okay?" "No." The word was quiet, measured. "We're at JFK. I gathered that." Ava glanced toward the officers. "They said our tickets were fake." Jonathan blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The gate agent," Ava said. "Linda Parker. She said the executive partner tickets you booked were fraudulent." The room around Jonathan froze. The CFO slowly lowered the remote control. "She called security," Ava continued. "They escorted us out of the priority line." Jonathan turned his chair slightly away from the table. "What exactly happened?" "She didn't scan the tickets," Ava said. "She looked at us and decided we didn't belong in first class." Maya leaned closer to the phone. "They flagged our passports," she said quietly. "They said we're banned." Jonathan stood up. The executives around the table exchanged confused looks. "Where are you right now?" he asked. "Near the vending machines by entrance 3, Ava said. "Security won't let us back in line." Jonathan walked toward the window overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Far in the distance, the faint outline of JFK sat under the pale morning haze. "Okay," he said calmly. "Listen to me very carefully." Ava waited. "Do not argue with security," Jonathan said. "Do not leave the terminal." "What are you going to do?" Maya asked. Jonathan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned toward his assistant, Marcus, who was already standing beside the door with an iPad in hand. "Marcus," Jonathan said quietly. "Yes, sir." "Pull up the Centurion Air Fuel contract for JFK." Marcus blinked. "The exclusivity clause." "Yes, sir." Jonathan returned to the phone. "Ava." "Yes." Stay exactly where you are. A pause. Then Ava asked softly, "Are you coming here?" Jonathan looked out the window again. The corner of his mouth tightened. "Yes," he said, "I'm coming." The line went silent for a second. Then Maya spoke again. "Dad?" "Yes?" "She told us she didn't care if our father was Jay-Z." Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, something colder had settled behind them. "That's all right," he said calmly. "Give me 10 minutes." He ended the call. Behind him, the boardroom sat frozen. The CFO cleared his throat. "Mr. Collins, should we continue?" Jonathan slid his phone into his pocket and picked up his coat. "No," he said. Meeting adjourned. The executives exchanged uneasy looks. "What's going on?" one of them asked. Jonathan walked toward the door. "A personnel issue," he said. Then he paused and added quietly, "That is about to become a very large logistical issue for Centurion Air." The first thing that stopped was the fuel trucks. Out on the grey winter tarmac beyond the glass walls of Terminal 4, a long line of bright yellow tanker trucks sat beside 3 massive aircraft waiting for departure. The trucks carried a simple logo on their sides: Collins Energy. The engines idled for a moment, then one by one the drivers shut them off. The low rumble faded into a strange mechanical silence. Ground crew members looked up from their radios, confused. One of them waved toward the nearest driver. The man in the truck didn't wave back. He simply leaned against the door and folded his arms. Inside the terminal, nothing seemed different yet. Linda Parker continued checking passports and tagging bags. The businessman in the navy suit rolled his suitcase away toward security. Another couple stepped forward to the counter. The airport carried on with its familiar rhythm. Overhead, an announcement echoed through the hall about boarding for a flight to Chicago. Somewhere, a child cried. Coffee machines hissed. Life moved forward like it always did. Then Linda's screen flickered. The bright blue booking interface vanished for half a second and came back again. She frowned and tapped the keyboard harder. "Come on," she muttered. The passenger in front of her shifted his weight impatiently. "Is there a problem?" "No," Linda said quickly. "Just a system delay." But it wasn't just her computer. The large monitors mounted behind the check-in desk flickered too. Rows of flight information blinked black, then reappeared. Across the hall, a baggage handler looked up at the display board. Several departures suddenly changed status. Delayed. Then another. And another. The murmur started small, like wind through leaves. Travelers checking their phones. People glancing up at the screens. Linda didn't notice yet. She was too busy trying to override the slow-loading reservation system. "Passport, please," she said to the next passenger. The radio clipped to her belt crackled. Normally, the radio chatter was background noise. Gate assignments, baggage codes, the quiet mechanical language of airport logistics. This time, the voice coming through sounded sharp. "Ground to operations." Linda paused. "Ground to operations. We've got a problem at the fuel pumps," another voice responded. "Say again." "The trucks just stopped." Linda frowned. She pressed the talk button on her radio. "Operations, this is Priority Desk B4. We're having system issues up here. Is something down?" The response didn't come from the ground crew. It came from her boss, Mark Reynolds. and his voice sounded nothing like it usually did. "All stations hold boarding," he said. Linda blinked. Hold boarding? Hold boarding immediately. The passengers in front of her were starting to listen now. Linda pressed the radio again. "Mark, I've got a full flight to Zurich waiting to check in." Mark's voice came back louder this time. "Linda, stop boarding passengers." "Why?" "Because we don't have fuel." Linda froze. The words didn't register at first. "What?" "Collins Energy just issued a stop work order," Mark said. "Fuel supply has been suspended effective immediately." Linda's mouth opened. She didn't realize she was gripping the counter until her fingers started to wake. Across the terminal, another announcement echoed. "Attention passengers, Flight 808 to Zurich is now delayed." The murmur in the terminal grew louder. Linda's eyes slowly lifted toward the far side of the hall, toward the vending machines. Ava and Maya Collins were still standing there. Ava had her phone raised slightly now, recording, and she was watching the desk. Linda felt something cold move through her stomach. The name echoed in her head. Collins. Back outside, a line of ground crew had gathered near the fuel trucks. The drivers stood calmly beside their vehicles like statues. One of the ground supervisors jogged over, waving his clipboard. "What's going on?" he shouted. One of the drivers shrugged. "Orders came down from corporate." "What orders?" "No fueling. You can't just stop fueling," the supervisor snapped. "We've got 3 departures in 10 minutes. The driver didn't argue. He simply nodded toward the logo on the truck. "Take it up with the people who own the fuel." Inside the terminal, Mark Reynolds burst out of his office and hurried toward the check-in desk. His tie was crooked. Sweat already darkened the collar of his shirt. "Linda," he said, "what did you do?" Linda stared at him. "I didn't do anything." Mark looked past her at the screens. 4 more flights had turned red. Delayed. Passengers were pulling out phones now, whispering nervously. "Collins Energy suspended our fueling authorization," Mark said quietly. "That's impossible," Linda said. "We have a contract." Mark swallowed. "Exactly." Linda's stomach dropped another inch. Across the hall, Ava lowered her phone slightly. Maya leaned closer to her. "Is this really happening?" she whispered. Ava didn't answer, but her eyes stayed fixed on the check-in desk. Near the desk, the radio crackled again. "All Centurion flights at JFK are now grounded until further notice." That announcement did it. The murmur turned into noise. Passengers began talking over each other. Phones rang. A man in a grey coat stepped forward angrily. "What do you mean, grounded?" Mark held up both hands. "We're working on it. How long is the delay?" Mark didn't answer, because he didn't know. Linda slowly sat down. Her brain was racing now. Collins. The tickets, the 2 girls near the vending machines. She turned again. Ava was still watching her, still recording. And for the first time since the confrontation began, Linda realized something terrifying. Those girls weren't upset anymore. They were waiting. Outside on the airport access road, a black SUV rolled through the security gate and accelerated toward Terminal 4. Another SUV followed behind it. Inside the first vehicle, Jonathan Collins sat in the back seat with one hand resting calmly on the leather armrest. His assistant Marcus sat across from him holding a tablet. The clause is clear, Marcus said quietly. Vendor may suspend operations immediately if client conduct creates reputational harm. Jonathan nodded once. And? Centurion signed the agreement 3 years ago. Jonathan looked out the window as the terminal came into view. Good, he said. Marcus hesitated. Sir, suspending fuel across an entire airport hub is going to create chaos. Jonathan didn't look at him. Yes, he said. That's the point. Inside Terminal 4, the sound changed. Airports usually hum with movement, rolling luggage, distant boarding calls, the soft roar of jet engines filtering through glass and steel. Now the hum had fractured. Clusters of passengers were forming beneath the departure boards, pointing upward as the red delay notices multiplied. A woman near the security entrance spoke sharply into her phone. 2 men in business suits argued with a gate agent across the hall. The line at the Centurion counter had stopped moving entirely. Linda Parker sat rigid behind her desk. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, but she wasn't typing anymore. Across the counter, a man in a charcoal overcoat slapped his passport down. My flight to Zurich leaves in 40 minutes, he said. Why does the board say delayed? Linda forced a smile that felt brittle on her face. Temporary fueling issue, sir. It should be resolved shortly. The man stared at her. Fueling issue? Yes. That sounds like something you resolve before passengers check in. Linda's smile didn't change. We're working on it. The man snatched his passport and stepped aside, muttering under his breath. Behind him, another traveller leaned across the counter. Are we going to miss our connection in London? Linda glanced down at her screen again, still frozen. Her radio crackled once more. Operations to all Centurion staff. The voice belonged to the airport operations coordinator now, not Mark Reynolds. All flights are holding position until fuel authorization is restored. Repeat, all flights holding. Linda felt the words like a pressure behind her eyes. Holding. That meant the aircraft already at the gates couldn't depart. It meant incoming flights would start stacking in holding patterns. It meant chaos. She slowly turned her head toward the far side of the terminal again. The vending machines stood beneath a pillar of white light from the ceiling, and beside them stood Ava Collins. Still. Calm. Her phone raised casually at chest level, recording everything. Linda's stomach tightened. Ava lowered the phone slightly and said something to her sister. Maya glanced toward the check-in desk, her expression still uneasy. But Ava's expression was different. Quiet. Controlled. The expression of someone who already knew how this would end. Linda quickly looked away. Across the terminal, Mark Reynolds rushed back toward the counter, his phone pressed against his ear. Yes, he said sharply. I understand the clause. He listened for a moment, then ran a hand through his thinning hair. No, you listen to me. We have 3,000 passengers in this building right now. Another pause. His voice dropped. I don't care if the contract allows suspension. We need the fuel restored immediately. He hung up and slammed the phone against the counter. Linda looked up. Well? Mark stared at her. Do you know who Collins Energy is? Linda blinked. Obviously. They supply half the region. 90%, Mark corrected. Linda felt her pulse start to pound. Mark leaned closer to the counter, lowering his voice. The suspension order came directly from the CEO. Linda felt the air leave her lungs. Why? Mark didn't answer immediately. His eyes slowly drifted across the terminal, toward the vending machines, toward the two sisters, then back to Linda. You tell me. Linda shook her head instinctively. That's ridiculous. Is it? Mark gestured toward the board. 6 more flights had just turned red. Delayed. A man in a navy blazer approached the counter angrily. My wife is stuck on a plane on the runway, he said. The captain says they're waiting for fuel clearance. Mark didn't even look at him. He was still staring at Linda. Did you interact with anyone unusual today? Linda's throat felt dry. No. Anyone from Collins Energy? No. Mark's voice hardened. Anyone with the last name Collins? The silence stretched. Linda's eyes flicked across the hall again. Ava Collins was still watching the desk, still filming. Linda turned back slowly. Her voice came out weaker than she expected. There were 2 girls. Mark's eyebrows lifted. Girls. They had executive partner tickets, Linda said quickly. But they looked suspicious. I flagged them. Mark's face drained of color. You what? I followed protocol. You flagged them? Yes. Where are they now? Linda pointed across the hall. Security escorted them out of the line. Mark followed her finger. He saw them instantly. 2 young women standing quietly near the vending machines, watching the entire terminal unravel. Mark felt something cold crawl up the back of his neck. You flagged them before verifying the ticket? Linda hesitated. I intended to verify. Did you verify? No. Mark closed his eyes briefly. Jesus. Linda bristled. They were aggressive. Were they? They refused to leave the priority lane. Mark rubbed his forehead. Linda. What? Do you know who Jonathan Collins is? Linda frowned. Should I? Mark stared at her. He owns the fuel sitting under every airplane outside this building. Linda felt her stomach drop. No, she said quickly. That can't be related. Mark didn't answer, because at that exact moment, the automatic glass doors at the VIP entrance slid open. A hush moved through the terminal. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But people noticed. First came 2 large men in dark suits, private security. They walked with the calm, deliberate movement of men who didn't need to push anyone aside. People simply stepped away. Behind them walked Jonathan Collins, tall, broad-shouldered, charcoal grey overcoat hanging perfectly from his frame. His expression was unreadable. Flanking him was a sharply dressed woman carrying a leather portfolio, his lawyer. Behind them hurried the airport operations director, Robert Henderson, who looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. Mr. Collins, please, Henderson said quietly as they walked. We can resolve this privately. Jonathan didn't slow down. His eyes moved across the terminal, scanning, searching. And then he saw them. Ava, Maya, standing beside the vending machines. The procession stopped. Jonathan walked toward them. His security team spread out slightly, forming a quiet perimeter around the family. Maya stepped forward first. Dad. Jonathan didn't speak immediately. He wrapped one arm around her shoulders and pulled both daughters into a brief embrace. It lasted only a few seconds, but half the terminal was watching now. Jonathan stepped back and looked at Ava. "Are you all right?" Ava nodded. "Yeah." Jonathan's eyes moved to Maya. "Did anyone touch you?" "No." Jonathan nodded once. Then he turned his head slowly toward the Centurion check-in desk. Linda Parker was standing now, frozen behind her counter, watching the man who had just walked into the building, watching the man whose company had just stopped every aircraft in the terminal from flying. Jonathan Collins began walking toward her, and the entire terminal watched him do it. Jonathan Collins walked through the terminal like a man who already owned the room. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. But the space in front of him cleared instinctively as he moved. Passengers stepped aside. Conversations faded. Even the angry murmuring that had filled the terminal minutes earlier seemed to shrink under the weight of his presence. Behind him, his security team moved quietly, creating a calm but immovable corridor through the crowd. At the Centurion check-in desk, Linda Parker felt the blood draining from her face. Mark Reynolds stepped forward instinctively, adjusting his tie as if professionalism alone might contain the situation. "Mr. Collins," Mark said quickly, forcing a tight smile. "Welcome. I'm Mark Reynolds, station manager for Centurion Air here at JFK. I believe there's been some kind of misunderstanding regarding our fueling contract. If we could step into my office?" Jonathan didn't slow down. He walked straight past him. Mark's voice trailed off behind him like a door closing. Jonathan stopped directly in front of the check-in podium. Linda Parker stood frozen behind the counter, one hand still holding a passenger's boarding pass halfway over the scanner. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched across the terminal. Phones were raised now everywhere, a forest of glowing screens capturing the moment. Jonathan rested both hands on the counter. They were steady hands, well-groomed, hands that had signed contracts worth billions. He looked up at Linda. "Parker," he said calmly. Linda swallowed. "Why?" "Yes. You're the lead agent here." Linda nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir." Jonathan tilted his head slightly. "Excellent." His voice was quiet, but it carried easily across the growing crowd. "That means you're the person responsible for the decisions made at this desk." Linda opened her mouth, but no words came out. Jonathan turned slightly. "Veronica." His lawyer stepped forward and placed a document on the counter. A contract, thick paper. Executive partner agreement between Centurion Air and Collins Energy. Jonathan tapped the paper lightly. "My daughters," he said, without looking away from Linda, "were denied boarding here this morning." Linda's throat tightened. They were flagged by the system." Jonathan's eyebrow lifted slightly. "Were they?" Linda nodded quickly. "Yes. Their tickets were suspicious." Behind Jonathan, Ava's voice spoke clearly. "That's not true." The entire terminal turned toward her. Ava stepped forward beside her father, holding her phone. "You didn't scan the tickets," she said calmly. "You looked at us and decided they were fake." Linda's face flushed red. "That's not what happened." Ava pressed a button on her phone. The recording began playing through the speaker. The audio was sharp, clear. Linda's voice echoed across the terminal. "I don't care if your father is Jay-Z." The crowd murmured. The recording continued. Fraudulent tickets. Step aside. Security. Then Ava's own voice. Calm. Measured. Scan the tickets. Then Linda again. You're denied boarding. The recording ended. The silence that followed felt heavier than the chaos earlier. Jonathan looked back at Linda. That, he said softly, doesn't sound like a system flag. Linda's lips trembled. They were aggressive. Jonathan's eyes hardened slightly. Aggressive. Yes. They refused to leave the line. Jonathan nodded slowly. Then he straightened and turned toward the passengers watching. For those of you wondering why your flights are not boarding, he said. His voice carried across the entire check-in hall now. It is because Collins Energy does not supply fuel to companies that profile my daughters as criminals. A ripple moved through the crowd. Some passengers lowered their phones in shock. Others raised them higher. Jonathan continued. Your flight delays are not caused by weather. They are not caused by mechanical issues. They are caused by a Centurion employee who decided that two young women wearing hoodies could not possibly belong in first class. Linda felt her knees weakening behind the counter. Mark Reynolds stepped forward desperately. Mr. Collins, he said, lowering his voice, we can resolve this situation quickly. I assure you the airline values your partnership. Jonathan turned his head slowly toward him. Do you? Yes. Because at the moment your company appears comfortable allowing one employee to jeopardize a multi-billion-dollar fuel contract. Mark's face tightened. That is not our intention. Jonathan nodded slightly. Good. Mark swallowed. What exactly would you like us to do? Jonathan looked back at Linda. She looked suddenly smaller behind the counter. The authority she had wielded earlier had evaporated. Passengers watched her now with open curiosity, some with anger, some with quiet satisfaction. Jonathan checked the time on his watch. You have 5 minutes, he said calmly. For what? Mark asked. Jonathan's gaze didn't move from Linda. For Centurion Air to demonstrate that it understands the difference between customer service and discrimination. Mark hesitated. Are you asking for an apology? Jonathan almost smiled. No. His voice dropped lower. I am asking for accountability. The radio on Linda's belt crackled again. Another operations update. Flight 808 to Zurich will miss departure slot if fueling does not resume within 10 minutes. Mark looked at the board, then back at Jonathan, then slowly turned toward Linda Parker. Linda's eyes widened. Mark. Mark's voice came out tight. Linda. She shook her head. Don't do this. You flagged executive partner tickets without verification. They looked suspicious. They looked young, Mark said. They looked like trouble, Linda whispered. The words hung in the air. Jonathan didn't react. He simply watched. Mark closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, the decision had already been made. Linda Parker, he said slowly. You are relieved of duty effective immediately pending investigation. Linda gasped. You're firing me? I'm suspending you. Because of them? Her finger pointed toward Ava and Maya. Jonathan spoke quietly. No. Mark looked at her. "We're suspending you because you just cost this company more money in 1 hour than you have earned in your entire career." Linda's hands began to shake. Mark extended his hand across the counter. "Your badge." Linda stared at it, then slowly unclipped the lanyard from around her neck. The plastic ID card hit the counter with a soft click. Across the terminal, the same 2 officers who had escorted the sisters earlier stepped forward again. Officer Miller cleared his throat. "Ma'am." Linda looked at him helplessly. "Please come with us." And the path they led her down was the exact same path Ava and Maya had been forced to walk less than an hour earlier. Linda Parker did not move at first. Her hand still rested on the edge of the counter where her badge had landed. The plastic card stared up at her like an accusation. Around her, the terminal had gone quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not confusion, not tension, judgment. Officer Miller shifted his weight and cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said gently, "we need to go." Linda blinked as if waking from a dream. Her eyes moved slowly across the faces surrounding the counter. Passengers who minutes ago had been strangers in line were now watching her with cold curiosity. A few still held up their phones. No one looked sympathetic. She looked toward Mark Reynolds. "Mark," she said weakly, "I've worked here 20 years. Mark didn't answer. His eyes had moved to the floor. Linda's voice cracked. "My pension?" Mark exhaled slowly through his nose. "Linda," he said quietly, "you should go." The words were soft, final. Linda's shoulders sagged. For a moment, she looked like someone 20 years older. She reached for the badge on the counter and pushed it toward Mark with trembling fingers. Officer Davis stepped closer. "We'll walk you to the exit." Linda nodded slowly. She stepped away from the podium. The same podium she had ruled over all morning. The small raised platform that had given her power over every traveler who passed through that lane. Now it felt like a stage she was being pushed off. As she walked around the counter, the crowd parted automatically. Not dramatically. Just enough to create a narrow path toward the terminal doors. Linda's eyes lifted once. Across the hall, Ava Collins stood beside her sister, watching. Not smiling, not gloating, just watching. The silence followed Linda all the way across the polished floor until the sliding doors hissed open and closed behind her. Inside the terminal, the air shifted again. Mark Reynolds wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. The sweat had soaked through the collar of his shirt now. He looked at Jonathan Collins carefully. "She's gone." Jonathan didn't reply immediately. He turned his head slightly toward Ava and Maya. "Are you satisfied?" he asked quietly. Maya hesitated. "I didn't want anyone fired," she said softly. Jonathan nodded once. "Consequences are rarely what we want," he said. "They are simply what follow actions." Ava said nothing. Her eyes moved toward the giant windows overlooking the runway. Outside, the yellow Collins energy trucks still sat motionless beside the aircraft. Passengers began murmuring again as the reality of the situation returned. Flights were still grounded. Mark cleared his throat. "Mr. Collins," he said carefully, "now that the personnel issue has been resolved." Jonathan turned toward him. "Yes?" Mark gestured helplessly toward the windows. "The fuel." Jonathan followed his gaze. Beyond the glass, a row of aircraft stood frozen in place, jet bridges attached like lifelines that led nowhere. Pilots paced on the tarmac. Ground crews waved radios in frustration. The entire operation of the airport hung in suspension. Jonathan slid a hand into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. He glanced at Ava. "You recorded everything?" "Yes." "Good." He dialed a number. The call connected instantly. "Operations," Jonathan said calmly. "This is Collins." He paused, listening. "Yes." He glanced at the runway again. "Resume flow." Another pause. "Authorization code, Sierra Alpha 1. A moment later, the low growl of diesel engines rolled across the airfield. Inside the terminal, the sound vibrated faintly through the glass. Passengers turned toward the windows. One by one, the yellow fuel trucks roared back to life. Drivers climbed into their cabs. Hydraulic arms extended toward waiting aircraft. A wave of applause erupted from the crowd near the gates. It started with a few scattered claps, then more. Soon the entire terminal echoed with it. Not just relief, approval. Mark Reynolds exhaled deeply, the tension draining from his shoulders for the first time in an hour. "Thank you," he said quietly. Jonathan slipped the phone back into his pocket. "You're welcome." Mark hesitated. "We will, of course, be reviewing all staff procedures moving forward." Jonathan gave a faint nod. "I would recommend that." Mark gestured toward the check-in desk. "Your daughter's boarding passes will be reissued immediately." A young agent had already hurried over to the printer. 2 thick gold-edged tickets slid out of the machine. Mark picked them up and walked toward Ava and Maya. "Miss Collins," he said respectfully, offering the tickets with both hands. "You've been upgraded to the residence suite for the Zurich flight." Maya blinked. "That's not necessary." "It is the least we can do," Mark said. Ava took the tickets. The heavy card stock felt almost absurd after everything that had happened. "Thank you," she said. Mark nodded quickly and stepped back. Jonathan looked toward the departure gates. "Your flight will start boarding soon." Maya turned to him. "Aren't you coming with us?" Jonathan shook his head. "I still have a board meeting waiting for me." Ava smiled slightly. "They're probably terrified." Jonathan's expression softened just a little. "They should be." He placed a hand briefly on Maya's shoulder. "Go enjoy your vacation." The sisters nodded. As they began walking toward the security checkpoint, the crowd parted again. This time, it wasn't fear. It was respect. Officer Miller stood near the rope barrier. When the sisters approached, he lifted the velvet rope himself. "Have a good flight," he said quietly. Maya nodded politely. "Thank you." Ava walked past without slowing. Behind them, Jonathan Collins watched his daughters disappear into the priority lane. Then he turned and walked back toward the exit, his security team falling in behind him. Across the terminal, the departure boards flickered again. Delayed flights shifted back to green. And slowly, one by one, the aircraft outside began preparing for departure. The engines started again outside. From the wide glass walls of Terminal 4, passengers watched the long yellow fuel trucks glide slowly across the concrete like a convoy waking from sleep. Hydraulic hoses uncoiled. Ground crews jogged back into position. Pilots climbed ladders toward cockpits. The airport heartbeat had returned. Inside the terminal, the mood had shifted completely. Where there had been anger and confusion an hour earlier, there was now something closer to awe. People were still whispering about what they had just witnessed. Some replayed the video clips they had recorded. Others simply stared at the boarding boards, shaking their heads. Near the priority security entrance, Ava and Maya Collins stepped onto the escalator that carried first-class passengers up toward the Centurion Lounge. The wheels of their suitcases rolled quietly over the polished floor. Maya exhaled slowly. "I still can't believe that just happened." Ava glanced down over the railing. Below them, the check-in area was still crowded with passengers, but the tension had faded. Airline staff moved faster now. Gate agents spoke more carefully, like people who had just watched a lesson unfold. "Dad went nuclear," Maya said softly. Ava didn't smile. He went contractual. Maya laughed quietly at that. They stepped off the escalator and entered the lounge reception area. Soft lighting, leather chairs, the smell of espresso and warm pastries. A receptionist looked up from her desk. The woman froze when she saw them. Her smile grew careful. "Welcome to the Centurion Lounge," she said. Ava handed over the new boarding passes. The receptionist scanned them quickly. Her eyes flicked to the names, then back to the sisters. "Of course," she said. "Your suite has been prepared." She gestured toward a private corridor. "Please follow me." Inside the lounge, the noise of the airport disappeared entirely. The thick carpet muted footsteps. A fireplace glowed quietly near the far wall. Travelers in expensive coats sat with laptops open, sipping coffee. Several heads turned as Ava and Maya walked past. Some of those people had been downstairs earlier. They recognized the faces now. The twins reached a glass door overlooking the runway. Maya set her suitcase down and leaned against the window. Outside, their plane waited at Gate B14, a Boeing widebody, preparing for its transatlantic departure. Fuel trucks were still connected to the wings. "You know what's crazy?" Maya said. "What?" "We just grounded half an airport." Ava folded her arms. "No." "What do you mean, no?" "We didn't ground anything." Maya raised an eyebrow. "Really?" Ava watched the ground crew outside for a moment. "The contract did." Maya shook her head. "You sound exactly like Dad." Ava didn't respond. Her phone vibrated in her hand. She glanced at the screen. "Dad," she answered. "Hey." Jonathan Collins' voice came through clear and calm. "You two in the lounge?" "Yes." "Good." Maya leaned closer so she could hear. Jonathan continued. "Boarding should begin in about 20 minutes. We see the plane." A pause. Then Maya asked quietly, "Are you in trouble?" Jonathan chuckled softly. "Not even a little." "What about the airport?" "The airport will survive." Maya hesitated. "And the woman?" "Linda." Jonathan's voice became thoughtful. "She made a choice." "Yeah. And choices have consequences." Ava spoke. "Did you mean to shut down the entire fuel line?" Jonathan didn't answer immediately. Then he said simply, "I meant to make sure someone listened." Downstairs in Terminal 4, Mark Reynolds stood beside the check-in desk, watching the last of the delay notices disappear from the screens. His phone buzzed again. Another call from corporate. He sighed before answering. Yes. A voice exploded through the speaker. Mark. What the hell happened down there? Mark glanced around the terminal. Passengers were boarding again. Staff moved briskly. Operations were stabilizing. We had a customer service incident, he said carefully. A customer service incident does not ground an entire airport hub. Mark rubbed his temple. It does when the customer owns the fuel. There was a long silence on the line. Then the executive spoke again. You're telling me the Collins family was involved? Yes. And we flagged them? Yes. Another pause. Then a quiet exhale. Jesus? Mark ended the call and leaned against the counter. Across the terminal, Officer Miller watched the boarding process from near the gate entrance. Passengers stepped through the scanner one by one. Passports checked. Boarding passes beeped. The normal rhythm of travel had returned. But Miller couldn't shake the feeling that something permanent had shifted. Earlier that morning, he had escorted 2 young women out of the priority lane without even asking their side of the story. Now he watched them walking down the jet bridge toward their aircraft, while airline executives practically bowed. The lesson was not subtle. Nearby, a young gate agent leaned toward him. Is it true? Miller glanced at her. What? The fuel thing. He shrugged. Looks that way. She shook her head. All because of that argument. Miller looked toward the jet bridge. No, he said quietly, because someone thought they could decide who belonged somewhere. On the aircraft, the first-class cabin glowed with soft amber lighting. A flight attendant greeted the sisters as they stepped through the door. Her smile was careful. Welcome aboard, Miss Collins. Ava nodded politely. Thank you. Their suite sat at the front of the cabin, a private space larger than some hotel rooms. Maya dropped into the leather seat and laughed. You realize this is the most expensive seat on the plane. Ava sat across from her. Dad probably already paid for half the fuel in the tanks. Maya looked out the window. The fuel truck disconnected its hose from the wing. The driver climbed back into the cab. Moments later, the truck rolled away. The aircraft shuddered slightly as the auxiliary engines powered up. Maya leaned back. Next time we fly commercial, she said, remind me to wear a blazer. Ava smiled faintly. Why? So people think we belong. Ava looked out the window again. The runway stretched into the distance. Beyond it, the city skyline glowed faintly in the winter light. They'll learn eventually, she said quietly. And far below the aircraft, the terminal continued moving again. But everyone who had watched the morning unfold understood something now. Sometimes the person you dismiss in line at an airport holds the keys to the entire system. 3 days later, the air above Zurich carried the scent of cold pine and melting snow. From the terrace of the Dolder Grand Hotel, the city looked like a painting. Slate rooftops dusted with white, church towers rising above narrow streets. In the distance, the Alps stretched across the horizon like a wall of silent giants. Ava Collins leaned back in the wicker chair, a wool blanket wrapped loosely around her shoulders. The late afternoon sun glinted off the glass railing in front of her. Beside her, Maya was hunched over her phone. You should see this, Maya said quietly. Ava reached for a piece of bread and dipped it into the pot of steaming fondue between them. See what? Maya turned the phone screen toward her. A video was playing. The angle was slightly shaky, clearly recorded by someone standing in line behind them at the airport. Linda Parker's voice cut through the audio. I don't care if your father is Jay-Z. Then the moment the security officers stepped forward, then the long walk toward the vending machines, then Jonathan Collins entering the terminal. Ava leaned back slowly. How many views? Maya glanced at the corner of the screen. 14.6 million. Ava stared at the mountains for a moment. Already? It was posted 6 hours ago. Who posted it? Some guy in a grey suit who was behind us in line. Maya scrolled down. The comment section moved so fast the text blurred. She read a few aloud. I travel through JFK every week. That gate agent always treated people like that. Another one. That CEO didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just turned off the fuel. That's real power. Another. Never judge a book by its cover, especially when the book owns the library. Maya laughed softly. This one says Collins' energy stock just jumped 4% this morning. Ava shook her head. That's ridiculous. Apparently investors love a CEO who enforces contracts. Ava picked up her phone from the table. Her screen was full of notifications, news alerts, emails, messages. She opened one article. The headline read, Airline employee profiles wrong passengers. CEO halts airport fuel supply in response. A second article showed a still image from the video. Jonathan standing in front of the check-in counter. Linda Parker frozen behind it. Passengers filming the confrontation. Ava sighed. I didn't want this to turn into a spectacle. Maya shrugged. Too late. Ava set the phone back down. I thought about posting the video myself. Why didn't you? Ava looked toward the mountains again. Because I didn't want the internet tearing someone apart. Maya leaned back in her chair. The internet's already doing that. Ava frowned. What do you mean? Maya hesitated. They found Linda Parker's social media. Ava turned back sharply. What? People are posting her LinkedIn profile. Her home address might already be floating around. Ava's expression hardened. That's not okay. I know. At that moment, Ava's phone buzzed. Dad, she answered immediately. Hey. Jonathan Collins' voice came through the speaker, calm as always. I assume you've seen the video. Ava glanced at Maya. Yes, it's everywhere. Jonathan sighed softly. My communications team has been fielding calls all morning. From who? News networks, financial analysts, a senator from New York. Maya leaned closer to the phone. What did you say? I declined everything. Why? Jonathan chuckled. Because I didn't shut down an airport to become a television guest. Ava smiled slightly. Fair. There was a pause. Then Maya asked quietly, Dad, are you mad about the video? No. Another pause. In fact, Jonathan said, Collins' energy stock rose 4.2% this morning. Maya laughed. You're kidding. The market interprets decisive leadership as strength. Ava rolled her eyes. Of course it does. Jonathan's voice softened. Listen to me, both of you. The sisters grew quiet. We live in a glass world now, he said. Every moment is recorded. Every mistake is amplified. Ava nodded slowly, even though he couldn't see her. Which means one thing matters more than anything else. What's that? Maya asked. Character. Jonathan continued. If you are bankrupt of character, no amount of public relations can fix it. Maya stared at the mountains. Did the airline apologize? Yes. Ava sat up slightly. What did they say? A formal letter arrived this morning. Jonathan paused. They offered both of you lifetime chairman status with Centurion Air. Maya's eyes widened. What does that mean? First-class seats on any route they operate. For the rest of your lives. Ava blinked. That's excessive. They're hoping you don't sue them. Maya laughed. Are we? Jonathan chuckled. No. Why not? Because the lesson was already delivered. Ava nodded slowly. That's true. Jonathan cleared his throat. Now listen. Yes. Stop reading the internet. Maya grinned. Too late? Jonathan ignored the comment. You're in Zurich. Enjoy the trip. Ava smiled. We will. Then Jonathan added one last thing. And Ava. Yeah? Next time you fly commercial. Yes? Wear the blazer. Ava laughed quietly. Why? Because it scares people like that. More than the hoodie. The call ended. The sisters sat in silence for a moment, watching the sun slide behind the mountains. Far away, thousands of miles across the ocean, Terminal 4 at JFK had already returned to its usual chaos. But the story of that morning was still spreading, and every person who watched the video learned the same lesson. Sometimes the quietest people in the room are the ones holding the switch that keeps the entire system running. 2 weeks later, Terminal 4 at John F. Kennedy International Airport looked exactly the same. That was the strange part. The same polished floors reflecting the overhead lights, the same rolling suitcases rattling over the tiles, the same long lines curling through the security barriers like rivers of impatient travelers. If you walked through the terminal that morning, you would think nothing unusual had ever happened. But the people who worked there knew better. Behind the Centurion Air priority counter stood a young gate agent named David Turner. 28 years old, fresh haircut, tie pulled just a little too tight around the collar. He scanned the boarding pass of the man standing in front of him and handed back the passport with both hands. "Welcome aboard, sir." His voice was polite. "Careful." The man nodded and rolled his suitcase toward security. David took a quiet breath before the next passenger stepped forward, because every employee at that desk knew the story now. They had all heard it in the break room. Some had watched it happen live. Others had seen the video later, replayed on phones during lunch breaks. The video that had been viewed tens of millions of times. The video that had turned an ordinary morning check in dispute into one of the most talked about incidents in the airline industry that year. Across the hall, a television mounted above the coffee kiosk played a news segment. The anchor's voice drifted across the terminal, The viral incident at JFK involving Collins Energy. CEO. Jonathan Collins has sparked new discussions about customer profiling in the airline industry. A traveler waiting in line looked up briefly, then back to his phone. The story was already fading into the endless cycle of news. But inside the airport staff offices, it was still fresh. In the employee break room behind the check-in area, 2 baggage coordinators sat at a table with paper coffee cups. "You ever see the video?" one of them asked. "Yeah, the part where the fuel trucks stop." "Yeah." The first man shook his head. "That's power." The other man laughed quietly. "Power is having the contract." Near the security entrance, Officer Miller stood beside the rope barrier again. Same position as that morning 2 weeks earlier. He watched passengers pass through the priority lane. Families, business travelers, college students heading home for winter break. Nothing remarkable. But every now and then he caught himself studying people more carefully. Not their clothes, not their luggage, their faces. Because 2 weeks earlier, he had made a mistake. He had seen 2 young women in hoodies and assumed the gate agent had already done her job correctly. He hadn't asked questions. He had simply followed the motion of authority. Now he understood something uncomfortable. Authority was only as good as the judgment behind it. A young man stepped up to the rope barrier. Athletic build, black tracksuit, headphones resting around his neck. He carried a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. 2 weeks ago, someone like Linda Parker might have flagged him immediately, asked him to weigh the bag, asked for extra identification, made him feel like an inconvenience. Officer Miller stepped aside and lifted the rope. "Morning," he said. The man nodded politely and walked through. Inside the terminal, David Turner glanced up from the screen as the passenger approached the desk. David noticed the tracksuit first, then the duffel bag. Then he stopped noticing those things entirely. He focused on the passport in the man's hand. "Good morning," David said. He scanned the boarding pass, a soft beep. Seat confirmed. David smiled. "Welcome aboard, sir." The man nodded. "Thanks." David handed the passport back and gestured toward the security checkpoint. "The lounge is just to your left after screening." The traveler thanked him and walked away. David watched him go for a moment. Then he turned back to the next passenger. Across the terminal, a cleaning crew pushed a cart past the vending machines, where Ava and Maya Collins had stood that morning. Most travelers walking by had no idea that Spot had once been the center of a confrontation that shut down half the airport. But the employees knew. They still talked about it sometimes in quiet conversations. Not with anger, with caution. The story had become a kind of legend, a reminder. Never judge a passenger by appearance. Never assume you understand someone's position in the world. Because sometimes the person standing quietly in line is connected to the system in ways you cannot see. Sometimes they are simply another traveler. And sometimes they are the person who supplies the fuel that keeps the entire airport moving. Later that afternoon, a supervisor walked past the check-in desk and paused beside David. "You're doing good," she said quietly. David nodded. "Just doing the job." She smiled slightly. "Exactly." He watched another group of passengers approach the counter, an older couple with matching suitcases. The man looked tired. The woman held his arm gently as they walked. David greeted them with the same careful tone. "Good afternoon." They smiled back. As the line moved forward and the terminal buzzed with the steady rhythm of travel, the memory of that morning lingered like an invisible presence. Not dramatic, not loud, just there. A silent warning that floated through every corner of the airport. Treat people with respect, not because they might be powerful, but because you never truly know who you are standing in front of. And sometimes the person you dismiss as unimportant is the one holding the keys to everything. The story of that morning did not disappear. Airports are places where thousands of small stories happen every day. Missed flights, surprise reunions, business deals whispered over coffee, arguments at security checkpoints, lost luggage and delayed planes. Most of those stories vanish the moment the aircraft door closes. But some linger. What happened that morning in Terminal 4 became one of those stories, not because of the delay. Airlines delay flights every day. Not because of the argument. Passengers argue with staff in airports across the country every single hour. What made this story different was the moment when quiet power revealed itself. Weeks later, the video still circulated online. Millions of people had watched it. They watched the moment two young women stepped up to a check-in desk wearing hoodies and carrying expensive luggage. They watched a gate agent glance at them and decide something, not based on evidence, not based on a system alert, based on a feeling. A judgment formed in a fraction of a second. Then they watched the consequences unfold. Security called. Passengers staring. Two young women escorted away from the priority lane like criminals. And then the moment, everything changed. A man walking through the terminal with the calm certainty of someone who did not need to shout. A man who understood contracts better than arguments. A man who understood leverage better than anger. Jonathan Collins never raised his voice that morning. He never threatened anyone. He simply reminded the world that systems are built on agreements, fuel contracts, supply chains, operational trust, and when those agreements are broken, the entire structure trembles. Inside the aviation industry, the incident became a quiet case study. Executives discussed it in conference rooms. Human resource departments added new training modules. Customer service managers replayed the video during staff briefings, not to embarrass anyone, but to remind employees of something painfully simple. Every passenger standing in line deserves the same basic respect, not because they might be powerful, but because respect is the foundation of every service business. In New York, Jonathan Collins returned to his office the same afternoon the airport resumed operations. His board meeting continued. Contracts were reviewed. Quarterly projections were discussed. For him, the incident had already passed. For his daughters, it became something else. Ava Collins never posted her recording. The video that went viral had come from someone else in line. A stranger who had simply captured the moment as it unfolded. But Ava kept her copy. Not as a trophy, as a reminder. A reminder of how quickly people are judged by what they wear. A reminder of how fragile dignity can feel when authority is used carelessly. And a reminder of the quiet strength that comes from knowing exactly who you are. Maya Collins eventually laughed about the situation weeks later while telling the story to friends. But even she admitted something had changed for her. Before that morning, airports were just another stop in a busy life. After that morning, every check-in desk looked slightly different. Every interaction carried a quiet awareness, the awareness that systems are built by people, and people make choices. Linda Parker disappeared from the public conversation quickly. The internet moved on. New scandals replaced old ones. But inside the airline industry, her story remained a warning. 20 years of experience erased in a single morning because one decision ignored fairness, one assumption made without evidence, one moment when authority forgot its responsibility. Back at JFK Terminal 4, the airport continued operating exactly as it always had. Planes took off. Passengers rushed for connections. Suitcases rolled across polished floors. But the employees who worked there knew something the travelers did not. They knew that one morning, not long ago, the entire airport had stopped moving. Not because of weather, not because of mechanical failure, because someone had forgotten the simplest rule of service: treat people with respect. And when that rule was broken, the person they had dismissed quietly reached over and turned off the fuel. Power does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it stands quietly in line. Sometimes it wears a hoodie. Sometimes it waits patiently until the moment it needs to act. And when it does, the entire system suddenly remembers how important respect really is. Stories like this travel far because they remind us of something deeper than revenge or victory. They remind us that dignity is not a privilege reserved for the powerful. It is something every person deserves the moment they step into a room. And the world works better when we remember that before making judgments. If this story stayed with you, show a little support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel for more stories where respect, character, and consequences collide. And if this moment made you think about the way people should be treated, leave 3 words in the comments that capture the lesson of this story. Respect over ego.